Good morning! Happy February! This is actually the first time in 2023 that I, Sarah, have posted on this channel. I entered 2023 in kind of a burnout phase of my life. I had a lot of work from 2022 that carried over into the new year, and a lot of major tasks that were really weighing on me, and as a result I got pretty burned out during the month of January. But now that it's February, the first semester in the school system where I work is done. So all of those tasks are off my plate. There's a couple other big things that I was able to cut out from my life, and now I think things are going to be a lot less stressful moving forward. Now, because I was burned out and exhausted for most of the month of January, I also found myself in a reading slump. I did not finish a single book in the entire month of January. So I'm hoping with my February TBR to kind of jumpstart that momentum a little bit more. The stack of books that I have next to me, which I don't think you can see in the camera, is pretty much a cross-section of all the genres I most frequently love to read. So there is some young adult in there, there's some historical fiction, some fantasy, some classics. In fact, I think the only genre that I typically read that is not represented here is like LGBTQ literature, although I did pick up A Restless Truth by Freya Marsk. I just picked this up to read a couple pages of it because I've really been anticipating this book, and now I am 82 pages in, so it might be just about time to admit that I am actually reading this book. And this one is a LGBTQ fantasy, the sequel to A Marvelous Light. Anyway, so because I've been in a reading slump, my first order of business for February is to finish my January TBR. And that starts with finishing the book I've actually been endeavoring to read for the entire month that's just passed, which is The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicola Yoon. This is a young adult romance about two high schoolers. One is an immigrant from Jamaica whose family is about to get deported because their undocumented status was discovered when her dad got into a little bit of trouble. And the other is a Korean-American boy who is trying to live up to his family's expectations and is interviewing to go to Yale. And they are both in the city when they meet. This story takes place in one day. I chose this book randomly from a challenge that I set for myself called Read the Library, where I try to randomly choose books from the school library where I work so that I can get a better idea of what's out there in our school library, and also choose books that I might not necessarily have chosen for myself. The reason I picked this one instead of my other January book to start with is because I knew that I was a little bit burned out, and this has very short chapters. Most of them are 1 to 3 pages long. I was hoping that meant that it would be easier to make progress on the book and get my momentum up. But it actually turns out that it's making it harder for me to focus in some ways on the book, because I'll read a couple of pages and then walk off and do something else and kind of neglect to come back to it. It is still a good book. I'm enjoying it so far. I'm about halfway through. I'm enjoying the writer's style. Her voice is very good. I don't know that this is going to be a 5-star read for me. There's some stuff that's just not connecting with me. But it is a good book. It was a good book for me to start the year with. And I think it won't take me long, now that I'm less burned out and less in a reading slump, to get it finished. As you saw at the end of my picking my 2023 TBR shelf, my other choice for January was The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende. This was for the Owned Books TBR, which is a challenge on Storygraph. You can search it by the title Owned Books TBR. And it challenges you to read books that you already have on your shelf. The prompt that I chose this for was a translated work, and this is the most anticipated for me of the translated works. I know when I figured out that the movie of this was based on a book, I started looking for it in high school at my local used bookstores, and that's where I found this copy. But I haven't read it yet, even though it's been years and years and years, so I am hoping to read that after The Sun Is Also a Star. Now on to my February choices that are actually for February. If you saw the 2023 TBR shelf video, there's actually 3 categories you'll have heard of that I choose every month for my TBR. The first one is that Read the Library Challenge, the second one is this Owned Books TBR, and the third one is the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge, which is published every year. It just so happened that The Sun Is Also a Star fit a Pop Sugar Reading Challenge category, as well as being a book that I randomly chose out of my library. So for February, the category that I chose for Pop Sugar's 2023 challenge was a celebrity book club pick. I looked a little bit at the lists of books that have been chosen as celebrity book club choices for Oprah, for Reese's Book Club, for the Jenna Hager Bush. I looked at all those book club picks, and the number of choices was just too many. So I chose the one that I knew I already had at home, which is The Christie Affair by Nina de Gramont. This is a book that is, I think, somewhat loosely based on an actual event that's said to have happened in Agatha Christie's life, where she disappeared at one point for several days. And I believe to this day nobody actually knows for sure where she went or what happened to her. She just reappeared one day, several days later. But this book is, I think, inspired by that. It's a Reese's Book Club pick, and I know that because it's got a little sticker on it. And I've actually been wanting to read that for quite some time, so I'm excited that it's on my February list. As for the Owned Books TBR, the choice of category that I made was a book that's part of a series. And I have so many books on my shelf that are a part of a series, but there was actually no contest for this one. I already knew that I was going to read Tehanu by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a reread for me. It's actually the only book on my TBR that's a reread. And I chose this for a really specific reason. When we went into lockdown for the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020, obviously, because I knew I was going to be stuck in the house for some time, we thought maybe 2 weeks and then a month, it ended up being a year. I knew immediately that it was going to be awful because there's a pandemic going on, of course it is. And I was looking for a way to make it a little less difficult for myself to be stuck in the house. And at the time, I was in a much bigger reading slump than I am right now. I was reading about 4 or 5 books a year in total and like sampling a couple others. So when I thought about how can I make this a little bit easier on myself, this transition into COVID lockdown, the first thing I thought of was, well, it would be really nice to get back into reading a little bit more. So I looked at my bookshelf. There were all kinds of books I'd never read on there, all kinds of books that I'd been excited about. But my eye just kept going to the Earthsea books, which were sitting on my shelf. I've had them for years. I love the Earthsea cycle. I got into it when I was somewhere in late high school, early college, and I've always loved them since the first time I read them, but it had been years and years, probably a decade or more at the time, since I had read them. And I just kept looking over at them and being like, I think that's the one. I think that's what I wanted to read. So I read the first 3 books over again. And then I got distracted by all of the other fun book options that were out there. And I never came back in my reread to the final book in the series. So in the interest of closure and completism, I want to read Tehanu for the series book in my Owned Books TBR. Now the final book that I have in my February TBR is my Read the Library choice for February, and this is where we're 2 months into this challenge that I've set for myself, and it called my bluff, you guys. For context, my library, the school library where I work, we don't have a separate section for like reference materials. So encyclopedias and anything else that you would consider like a reference book. We just have the fiction section and the nonfiction section. I think at some point we had a reference section years before I worked there, but during a library reorganization initiative, all of those books got recategorized and sorted into the Dewey Decimal categories that their content most closely relates to. So what that means is that I can't just filter out reference books on this challenge. There is a possibility that when I do this random number generation that I do to choose what section and what shelf and what book I'm going to read, I could select a reference book. And I think at the beginning when I was setting up this challenge, I had the opportunity to decide if I was okay with that. And I said, you know what? Whatever book I choose, that's the one I'm going to read. I'm not going to be selective about it. So in February, my brain said, are you sure about that? And I was like, yes, absolutely. Whatever I choose, that's what I'm going to read. So my Read the Library choice for February is Great Books of the Western World, Volume 59. The subject of this is 20th Century Imaginative Literature, Volume 1. So I will admit, this challenge didn't call my bluff as badly as it could have. It did provide me with this reference text, which I now have to read, which I don't think anyone in their life has ever read cover to cover. But the subject of it, at least, is like works of classic literature, which is 100% an area of interest for me. Not only that, but it's not actually a reference book in the sense of being like encyclopedia entries or something. What this book series is like collected works, like major works of seminal literature from whatever time period that volume is related to. So I actually checked volume 2 of 20th Century Imaginative Literature, which is volume 60 of 60 in this series. Contains a lot of works that I've actually read before, so that volume has The Great Gatsby, it has Waiting for Godot, it has T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. The thing that I think is important about this volume, which I think is the universe kind of moving me forward, is that this volume has either excerpts or full reprints of 9 different early to mid 20th century pieces of literature that you would think any classics fan would have read, but I haven't. I don't think I've read a single one of these. So we've got stuff from Henry James, from George Bernard Shaw, Joseph Conrad, like Heart of Darkness, all or part of that is in here. There's a Chekhov play in here. 6 Characters in Search of an Author by Luigi Pirandello. There's a 150-page section of Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. Death in Venice is in here. Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is in here. All of these, either in whole or in part, are just taken and reprinted in this book. So when I first took this off the shelf, I knew immediately it was going to be something out of this anthology, because I chose the Dewey Decimal section that's sort of the pre-100s. If you're familiar with the Dewey Decimal System, you know that it divides up books numerically, so it starts at about 001 and goes all the way up to 999, and the numbers represent categories and subcategories, and so they're arranged that way if it's nonfiction. So I got the pre-100s, and I went, oh, okay, there's a lot of really random interesting stuff in here. And when I chose a shelf, it was the last shelf of pre-100s in the Dewey Decimal System. And I went, oh no, because the only books that are on the last shelf in that numerical system are books from this series. And I actually didn't know what this series was. I've only ever really walked past it, dusted it off. So I picked this, and I had a moment where I was like, I could just put it back and choose something else. No one would ever have to know. But then I said, no, we're not setting that precedent, right? If I start telling myself I can put it back, then I'm going to start doing that for more and more books, and I'll never read anything that I wouldn't already have chosen for myself. So I said, okay, we're going to read this book no matter what it is. But I actually think this is going to be kind of a gift, because like I said, these are classic works of literature that define their genres, and I have never read any of them. And so as I started paging through this book, which like I said is pristine, I'm pretty sure I'm the first person to have ever opened this book on our shelves. I started looking at it and just reading paragraphs from Heart of Darkness, paragraphs from Uncle Vanya, from Remembrance of Things Past, from Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And just finding myself really interested in that like nerdy special interest way that classic literature does for me. So what I've realized is that I'm actually going to be so sort of educated by these works of literature. I'm actually giving myself kind of a gift. I'm giving myself an opportunity here. Now this one I'm not going to read cover to cover all at once. It has, like I said, 9 selections in here. So I will probably, on any day off or any weekend, I'll just focus on reading one of them. And then it'll probably take me up until maybe March or April, and then I'll be able to move on to something new. So these are the choices. This is the vibe for February. Wish me luck.